But my task now is to introduce our keynote speaker, Mark Cave. When we did decide on the theme of the conference, the first person that I thought of and wanted to suggest, and everybody agreed once they looked at his CV, and a few of us met Mark, was Mark Cave would be a perfect person. Mark comes from New Orleans, where he is, and I'll get this right, the senior curator of the historic New Orleans collection, which I now know has 140 staff. So this is a big outfit. It's a museum and a collection, and Mark's the senior curator there. You all know about Hurricane Katrina and its impact on New Orleans. Crisis has been part of their lives, but also part of Mark's historical work. And he, among other things, was a co-editor with Stephen Sloan of the book Listening on the Edge, Oral History in the Aftermath of Crisis, which was published in 2014. Mark's keynote is titled, Why Did This Happen? Making Meaningful Answers in the Aftermath of Crisis. Thanks so much for joining us, Mark.
I just want to thank you for having me. I never imagined I'd get to come to Tasmania, and it's such an honor to be here. The title of this presentation is Why Did This Happen? Making Meaningful Answers in the Aftermath of Crisis. It's about my experience in New Orleans doing oral history following a series of crises over the past 2 decades. It explores the media's influence on how these events were remembered and advocates for oral history to be a more active force in memory creation following crisis. Let me see if I can. Finding an explanation for why bad things happen is at the heart of most of the interviews we do. People need to know why something happened, and if they can't find good answers, they usually struggle to evolve in a positive way from the event. Journalists have traditionally been charged with finding these answers. They're called on to report in the midst or soon after crisis, and often have very little available information to craft stories. And as a result, they rely heavily on raw personal narrative, giving the style of their work the semblance of oral history. This type of reporting has proven very popular, particularly for 24-hour news networks during times of breaking news. In addition, people in the midst of crisis are sharing their stories on social media as situations unfold, and in the weeks and months after. For some, this access to social media is largely how their perspectives on the event will be formed. This process of sharing and contesting memories through social media helps build a feeling of community, perhaps alleviating some of the disconnectedness and isolation traditionally associated with post-crisis environments. From the moment television cameras are turned on and witnesses start posting images and experiences, a complex, ever-changing, and contested explanation for what happened and the impact of it is being formed. Such explanations are continually being shaped by the needs of the recovery and by political agendas, disinformation, and self-interest. The fact that journalists, particularly in countries like the US, work primarily for private companies that are beholden to market forces, influence how these explanations are being shaped, and ultimately what we collectively remember about a crisis. New Orleans, where I live, is a community that has been defined by 3 major crises over the past 2 decades. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, and the COVID pandemic in 2020. Doing oral history fieldwork in the aftermath of each of these crises offered insights into how our collective memory of such events is formed, and how the memory of one crisis impacts our response to the next. When Hurricane Katrina hit, New Orleans was already a broken community. The economic legacy of slavery and Jim Crow had led to deep class divisions based largely on race. The city struggled with generational poverty, high rates of violent crime, and the highest incarceration rate in the world. Social order, already very fragile, broke down completely in the aftermath of Katrina, and for weeks the world witnessed the worst of the city. A 70,000-seat sports arena, the Louisiana Superdome, was the epicenter of media attention during the week following the storm. Tens of thousands had sought refuge there, and with the city flooded and limited food and water, the human crisis escalated as the days passed. During the crisis, news networks reported that horrible things were happening inside the dome, including fatalities and a large number of assaults. These stories were pushed out by the cable news networks, perhaps to trigger a reaction from the rest of the country to the crisis that was unfolding. As the city began to rebuild, people needed to feel optimistic about the investment they were making to return. They wanted narratives that suggested that things were not as bad as initially reported, or projected blame for what happened outwardly, usually to governmental agencies and first responders. A narrative developed locally that the reports of what happened at the Superdome were largely apocryphal. As soon as journalists responded with headlines like "Superdome crime, more urban myth than real," such stories were simply reinforcing what the consumers of their product wanted to hear. This cleansing of memory was particularly important in the case of the Superdome, as it was home to the city's beloved professional football team and was the primary center for events that drove the city's tourist economy, which was so essential to economic recovery. When I interviewed members of a disaster medical assistance team from California that was assigned to provide assistance near the dome, I anticipated that they would affirm the growing narrative that the bad things that were reported from the dome were largely urban myth. But I was wrong. Team members indicated that numerous assault victims had been treated at their clinic, even a National Guard soldier with a gunshot wound, and that the death toll was far greater than had been reported. In fact, the team had to abandon their mission when their clinic was overrun by the crowd and several of their own doctors were attacked. Interview excerpts from medical team members were featured as part of an exhibition at my museum for the 5th anniversary of Katrina, providing compelling counter-narratives to this reimagining of the Superdome story. The team's chaplain, Toby Nelson, described his perspective on the situation at the Dome. You see, okay. It takes a few seconds to start.
I'd tell you the scariest part of the whole deployment. It was scary on the trip down. It was scary at the Superdome. What was most terrifying, and I think most alarming to all of us, was to see how quickly social order can break down. And I just phrase it in this way that, if you don't feed people, if people can't eat for 4 days or get clean water or take a shower for 4 days, the beast comes out. And several times I've shared that with people back here, and they say, well, that's those are black people, those are poor people. And I don't think it would make any difference at all. I think if it happened right here in San Francisco Bay Area, we would see the same beast come out. These were humans that have been pushed way past their limits, the social contracts that we normally have among each other of civility and decency. those sorts of peacetime ethics fade away, and people move towards what I call survival ethics. You know, I'll do whatever is necessary to feed my child, even if it means hurting you.
Nelson went on to note that many more people died at the dome than had been reported, and expressed anger at the media for its suggestion that the stories were apocryphal. During the years after Katrina, local memory of the event was shifting to respond to the needs of the recovery. As people worked to rebuild their homes and lives, most did not want to look honestly at the systemic problems that led to the city's meltdown. And although legal issues resulting from its post-Katrina collapse were being addressed, including the prosecution of police officers and medical personnel for alleged misconduct, there were other events which took place in the aftermath that were left unacknowledged as the city pushed forward. A group of first responders told me about a riot that had taken place in one neighborhood. They had been rescuing hundreds of people from tops by boat and dropping them off on a bridge connected to an area of higher ground. Once rescued, they had nowhere to go, and as the days passed and numbers grew, they became increasingly angry. According to one interviewee, the situation erupted when the crowd overheard an argument over what to do with the body of an elderly woman who had died. I remember riding my bike in this area shortly after returning, about a month after the storm. The whole city was still a mess, but this area seemed particularly apocalyptic. The shell of a burned-out city bus lay on the median of the street, and windows of nearby buildings had been smashed out. For the 10th anniversary...
This is the Katrina Files, a series featuring the perspectives of first responders who worked in New Orleans in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I'm your host, Paul Moss. The Katrina Files were created by the Historic New Orleans Collection in partnership with WWNO, New Orleans Public Radio. This series draws from oral history interviews conducted in 2008 with members of local, state, and federal response agencies. It is the first-person accounts of the chaotic events following the storm 10 years ago.
It's a bit cheesy now, but for the 10th anniversary of Katrina, we prepared a series of broadcasts for public radio. They featured some of these unacknowledged stories from the aftermath of the storm, and what you heard was the intro to the episodes. Each of the 4 episodes featured a handful of narrators and focused on a different unacknowledged story from the aftermath of Katrina. They aired periodically during the week leading up to the anniversary. The neighborhood where the riot took place is on relatively high ground and has become a very fashionable place to live in post-Katrina New Orleans. Real estate prices have soared, and trendy restaurants and nightclubs have opened up. As the anniversary approached, the community planned for a month-long celebration of the city's resilience and recovery. There were art installations, parades, panel discussions, and visits from President Obama, as well as former Presidents Clinton and Bush. The events were designed to present an optimistic tone and to promote to the world that the city had healed from Katrina and that it was ready for investment in tourism. As this anniversary approached, a fancy new market opened up not far from where the riot had taken place. The mayor came to acknowledge the grand opening, and new residents of the neighborhood came to sample fine foods and craft cocktails. Soon after, the market was trashed. Windows were smashed out and hateful graffiti sprayed on the walls. The optimism and hope for the future that was demanded and advanced by so many in the community was clearly not shared by everyone. Presenting these unacknowledged stories during the anniversary celebration provided powerful counter-narratives to this dominant collective story. The recovery effort following Katrina had the air of a PR campaign, and symbols of regional identity took on a greater significance. One of the most popular was the image of a mother pelican pecking at her own breast to feed her young, her own blood. This is an old Christian symbol of sacrificial love and had been used as an emblem of Louisiana for centuries. As people were making big sacrifices to rebuild their community, this image in particular became to many emblematic of the struggle to rebuild, and was used in the ongoing effort to sell the community to itself and to the rest of the country. In 2010, 5 years into the Katrina recovery, another major disaster hit. The Deepwater Horizon oil platform exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, about 40 miles south of New Orleans. The explosion killed 11 workers and caused an underwater oil spill, which released an estimated 4.9 million barrels of oil into the Gulf. The spill caused extensive damage to wildlife all along the Louisiana coast. The brown pelican, which had recently come off the endangered species list in Louisiana, was significantly impacted by the spill. The threat to this potent symbol of regional identity during the recovery triggered an emotional response to this new crisis. One of the organizations which led this response was the Louisiana Animal Response Team, which had been formed in the aftermath of Katrina to save pets abandoned during the evacuation. The team and those they recruited formed the labor force used by British Petroleum in the pelican rescue effort. The spill was, of course, a huge news story. 24-hour cable network showed a live feed of the oil gushing into the Gulf hour after hour for weeks, and journalists from all over the world descended on the region to cover the story. British Petroleum, however, closed off access to just about all parts of the response, except the Berg Rehabilitation Center. By doing this, they could move the narrative of the crisis as it was being presented in the media away from the ongoing damage being done to the Gulf to the more positive story of bird rescue. Images of rescued pelicans and the descriptions of the process used to save them were irresistible to the media. It was also an effort the community could be engaged in, giving us a sense that we were addressing the crisis and doing something to correct what went wrong. Of course, this work was important, but it was not stopping the ongoing damage done to the Gulf. Looking back at our oral history work in response to the spill, I think we fell into the same trap that was set by the oil company for the media, in that we focused our work on bird rescue and not to the extent we should have on the broader, more complex story of the impact of offshore drilling. But what I think our work did well was to explore the motivations of those involved in the rescue effort and how their experience during the Katrina recovery helped formulate their response to this new crisis. We featured segments from some of the interviews on public radio. This feature focuses on response team volunteer Bert Siegel. Let's see if I can do this. Sorry.
Louisiana, I didn't really know too much about until the oil spill, because that's when I got down into those areas where the marshes are. I'm sorry, I didn't see it before it was messed up. I started to look around and saw some of the places that weren't affected as opposed to the places that was, and it was heartbreaking because what they had before the oil spill was absolutely wonderful. And what a mess they made out of it, and that's the sorry point.
The Deepwater Horizon resulted in one of the worst environmental disasters in U.S. history.
I saw it on the news when it first happened, and I didn't quite understand what was going on until I started to show the oil pumping out of the hole every day, day after day, week after week. And every day I watched it, I started getting madder and madder and madder. and realized I was getting there and staying home wasn't the thing to do. So after watching the news, I managed to see a story about people taking care of pelicans that had gotten wild. So I jumped in my car and I went down to Venice, looking around for this pelican rehabilitation center. And after a couple hours, I finally found it, but they wouldn't let me in because it was a highly restricted area, and I had who am I? I just went down there banging on the door, want to let me in, I want to help. They wanted to know my background, so I did it on the internet, and they called me back, and 3 days later, I was there again. So I don't know where, all of a sudden now I'm an animal rehab agent without 5 minutes worth of experience. But I'll tell you, in a place like that, under those conditions, you get experience in a hurry. You've never seen anything like it in your life. Pelican after pelican, hundreds after hundreds of pelicans coated in oil, suffering, dying. It's something that changes your life.
This is a huge disaster, both for the natural world, for the ecosystem, because this stuff stays for a long time. And it's a human disaster.
I'll give you an example of what happened one night. A helicopter from the Coast Guard came in with 50 pelicans. They came in like dog carriers, big plastic boxes with metal doors. Well, each crate had one pelican in it, and we carried them. They were all covered in blankets. So we carried them directly from the helicopter into the facility. I never even looked at one. And then after we had finally unloaded all the pelicans and got them inside the building, I picked up the sheet and looked inside and lost it. I never seen anything so horrible.
The Gulf spill is a tragedy that never should have happened. I'm Tony Hayward. BP has taken full responsibility for cleaning up the spill in the Gulf. We've helped organise the largest environmental response in this country's history.
We go out every week to inspect these islands in the Gulf. Yes, they've got oil deposits on them, and they're telling people that the place is clean. I walk along Grand Isle Beach, they say it's clean. There's tar on my feet when they get back to the house. They tell me it's clean, it's not clean. So how are we ever going to get anywhere if they don't face the facts that it's not clean, and that they're just going to walk away and leave what's there? I mean, it's still there, they're gone.
For biologists, how this oil will affect wildlife is a huge concern.
We just walk the island from end to end, making a survey of sand and recording what we see, take photographs, take soil samples, recover dead birds, report dead turtles. We can't touch them because they're endangered. And we just make a thorough report of what's going on and keep turning these reports into people to see if anybody does anything. But until they do, we just keep going out there and monitoring what's going on, because somebody's got to tell them. We got to stay on these people, or else they're going to go away and forget about it. It's not like snow; it doesn't melt. I think it's something that's in my blood. It's something that I realize that I can do well, and I have somehow a calling for it. But I hope I never have to clean another oil bird again as long as I live. But if there ever is another oil spill and the problem comes up, I'll be there doing it. Believe me. Louisiana, I didn't really know too much about.
According to his narrative, Siegel's deep love of animals was formed by sharing his Katrina experience with his two cats, Buster and Romeo. When the levees broke, he threw his cats in a suitcase and climbed to the roof of his house, where they held on for days. He took them with him when he was evacuated and lived with them in a small government trailer for over a year when he rebuilt his home. This picture is taken by my wife, Patty. A number of them are. Katrina is still the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history, and the Deepwater Horizon is arguably the worst environmental disaster. By the time the pandemic hit in 2020, New Orleans had in many ways defined itself by overcoming catastrophic events and prided itself on its perceived resilience. As COVID cases were being confirmed in other parts of the U.S., the city held its annual Mardi Gras in February of 2020. Over 1 million people descended on the city, triggering a deadly outbreak. For a time, the city had the highest mortality rate in the world. News coverage during this first surge was focused on the city's exceptional ability to survive and flourish despite crisis. One news story focused on the civic group formed during the Katrina recovery, which during the first months of the pandemic raised money to hire out-of-work chefs to cook meals for healthcare workers. Another story featured a prominent burlesque dancer who created an online talk show hosted from her bathtub and a Pilates class with her dog. And yet another was about a woman who dressed up as a possum and would dance outside the windows of quarantined children for their birthdays. Another focused on a group of graffiti artists who painted the plywood that covered the windows of shuttered businesses to create a drive-through art gallery of sorts that became popular during the pandemic's first surge. Interest in these stories of resilience, as well as the narratives of survivors and medical personnel, began to wane as the pandemic persisted. Finding a narrative for COVID that would continue to satisfy the community's ongoing need for explanation was difficult. In the US, Trump-era politics provided many popular villains, and of course it was easy to blame China, but stuck in an ongoing crisis caused by something we couldn't see or fix, communities needed something more. We needed to feel that we were actively responding to some cause of the crisis, and that we were doing something to make things better. The murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 triggered a series of protests throughout the country and a renewed fight for social justice that still continues. The murder of Black men by police is sadly not uncommon in the US, and the Black Lives Matter movement had been around nearly a decade. The reaction to Floyd's killing, however, in the midst of the pandemic was something extraordinary. Floyd's killing and the issue of social justice became a dominant narrative arc in our interviews about the COVID pandemic. Even among medical personnel who were perhaps tired of telling the same heartbreaking stories from intensive care rooms, this issue of social justice became a dominant theme, perhaps necessary to give people a sense that we were somehow evolving through this painful time, that all this suffering was somehow leading to a correction of a long-standing social problem. One of our interviewees was Latoya Cantrell. She had risen to prominence through her work during the Katrina recovery and was elected the first Black female mayor of New Orleans in 2018. Issues of race and social justice were at the core of her COVID narrative.
The city of New Orleans decided that its future would be female when I ran for mayor. 2 females made it to the runoff, which was unprecedented, which we both made history in that. Ultimately, the community elected me as their first female mayor. Not just your first female, African American as well, being that female, and not being a native of the city of New Orleans. Post-Katrina, we saw these same disparities that always have to do with poverty, and we saw it front and center. But with this COVID, the world saw collectively how urban America and these disparities impact vulnerable populations of people. In the city of New Orleans, of course, our vulnerable population folks are those who are living at or below poverty, and also those who are living with issues associated with that. So whether that's underlying health conditions being very prevalent, access, of course, to adequate health care, even as it relates to work in an environment to have paid sick leave and the like or lack thereof. It exposed the tyranny of government, just the inequities that exist across the board. And of course, that came out front and center in terms of the population of folks being hit the hardest by COVID, with the majority, again, being African American. I'm one of 2 mayors from the United States on this global panel dealing with COVID-19. It's embarrassing representing the United States of America at this time. It's very embarrassing because this should have never happened in this country at all. And the way that we have responded has just been embarrassing. Wanting to be that bright spot, and I'm glad that I am on there because with New Orleans and the work that we're doing, we are a bright spot in this country, pointing to some results. And so that's not a bad place to be, but it's still embarrassing because they're looking at this country like, what the hell is this? So it's shameful. I'm embarrassed. You know, we supported the rights, of course, of our residents who responded to the horror of that murder. And as a Black person, understanding that it wasn't just the rage and the feelings weren't just about George Floyd. I mean, we were already knowledgeable of the police brutality, which has been going on in the Black community, has been talking about it for years, and that's actually how Black Lives Matter became to be, and standing up against police brutality. But Floyd's murder just was that lightning rod that said, you know what, enough is enough. And so I absolutely embraced that. Enough is enough. I think one, being the messenger, being a Black woman, and being the leader of this city, for the first time, you know, residents and folks had to hear from a Black woman telling them no. But I stood my ground, and at the same time doing what was right by this city, and also saying that I wouldn't be bullied, and I wasn't going to take the bait, and I didn't. And what was proven is not taking the bait, but also New Orleans has done everything right. And now we're in a state where we're fighting for our lives. The city of New Orleans.
New Orleans certainly did not do everything right during the pandemic, but after that initial surge, the mayor did institute, at least by US standards, fairly strict social distancing guidelines, which ultimately put her in conflict with many in the community. As the pandemic continued, she developed bad relationships with local media outlets, leading to an effort to recall her as mayor, which is currently ongoing. In August of 2021, the city was hit by another strong hurricane. The levee system protecting the city held, but a number of small towns outside this protection were destroyed. The city's focus on COVID seemed to dissolve in the aftermath of the storm, as it confronted perhaps bigger threats of climate change, land loss, and rising insurance rates. Oral historians have traditionally been content to let the process of memory creation following a crisis play out on its own, revisiting the event decades later to capture the significance of it in individual life stories or to study how our collective memory of such events were formed. Our current ability, however, to easily share collective narratives online and through social media allows oral historians to be more active participants in the process of memory creation during the complicated and contested period of recovery. What we are as a community is in many ways shaped by the memory of crisis. Each crisis impacts how a community reacts to the next one, and also how it remembers past crises. The lessons and impacts of each over the course of time conflate in memory, making the significance of each difficult to understand in the context of a traditional life story interview done decades after the event. The hope that we will emerge from each bad event somehow better than we were before is dependent on a nuanced understanding of what happened and of the factors which might have influenced and distorted our memory of the event. We need to acknowledge that the answers generated by traditional media sources are inadequate. Our explanations for each crisis are shaped by the needs of the recovery, by political agendas, disinformation, and self-interest. Awareness of how journalistic coverage is being influenced by these factors can frame a thoughtful application of oral history. This work and the sharing of these narratives during the recovery can play a big role in helping communities evolve through crisis. Oral history can encourage communities to embrace explanations which acknowledge systemic issues which may have amplified the problems caused by the crisis. It can dispel disinformation and mitigate market-driven journalistic bias. And can also address topics that don't fit into collective narratives. We grow through crisis and evolve from these events. Using oral history to help our communities evolve better is an important role we can offer. But the proper application of oral history in crisis settings is dependent on an understanding and an awareness of the forces at work in the process of memory creation. And so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. We've got about half an hour for Q&A, which is lovely, and a roving microphone. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, because COVID's still with us. I'm going to walk around with a microphone, and I think I'll probably keep your questions short, and because it may be that on the other side of the room people can't hear, so if necessary, I'll repeat the question.
We've got the microphones on hold.
Oh, that'll do. Okay. So you can take the poll to the person. Yeah? Okay, that's great. Maybe if you have one poll on each side, so it's easier to do. If you could just say who you are, don't tell us anything more than that when you ask the question, and then, okay, so who'd like to ask or comment or anything of what Mark's had to say this morning? And actually, I have a mic right away. So, yes. I can do this. This is exciting.
Thank you, Mark. That is sweet. And your interviews with the first responders and that, how many were they, and what was their reaction to being interviewed?
Yeah. Well, we focused on our Katrina project on first responders primarily because we were a private foundation, and so we weren't as impacted as other institutions were financially. And so we were able to come back to the city fairly early, about a month after the storm. And of course, the city was vacant. You know, most people had been transported out of the city. A lot of people, 100,000 or more, never came back. And so the people that were around us when we began the project were these first responding agencies. And we partnered with them and created kind of a system where we would convince them that maybe part of an after-action study of their response to the event. First responders were blamed by the media often in the event, so they were very wary of talking to the media, but their people still wanted to tell their stories. They were aware they were part of a really important historical event in the community and wanted to share that, and so we offered ourselves up to that process. And we did about 500 interviews with first responders, so it's a really good sort of blueprint of for further historical study on Katrina, in that they were pre-positioned in neighborhoods throughout the city, and so it gave us some insights that some of the early published writing on Katrina don't have. So.
I've got a question over here. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I was so interested to, sorry, my name is Freddie Taylor. I was so interested to see that so many images complemented your presentation, and that you've credited them here. So obviously you've looked widely for images. Do you connect images to the sound archive when you present them? And did you seek out images in the process of recording the interviews?
We did. I work at primarily a museum, and so these kinds of things are important. How I'm used to telling stories is based on images. We did collect, with the agencies we worked with at the Katrina Project, we asked them to donate what images they had. Some of them were in there, the really kind of low resolution flip phone images that some of the first responders took, but they're images of places that were usually out of reach, but the media is a great source. And that seems true with the other projects. We worked with the City Health Department for the COVID project, and we got some good photographic documentation of their early vaccine efforts and things like that. So it's part of what we do, and usually oral history is the tip of the spear in these documentation efforts, which lead to the acquisition of other things.
Thanks. I've got several questions. Oral history is the tip of the spear. I might like that as a slogan. So let's just here and then actually the other side. Maybe just at the front here, or no, just there.
That one? Sorry, I don't know how much of the
I've got the mic here. Why don't Linda, you go first.
Thank you. Thank you. My name's Linda Hunt. I was particularly impressed by your talk because I spent most of my career as a journalist. So, yeah, thank you. That was very impressive. So yesterday I gave a workshop about interviewing to some of the people here. And one of the most common questions or concerns is how do you deal with emotion in an interview?
Yeah.
Obviously, looking at the interviews you have done over time, you would have dealt with some very emotional and tricky scenarios. So I think that's a really good question for me to ask you. How did you deal with that through the interviews, and what advice can you give to oral historians?
I think I've gotten better at it over the years. I was really just starting out when we were doing the Katrina interviews, so looking back, I'm not sure if I handled those well, and they would often burst into tears at very odd moments of the interview, not necessarily the times you would think, but it was maybe a time when somebody was nice to them, like shortly after the event or something like that, that they'd burst into tears. And my initial reaction was just to kind of put my head down and, let them play out their emotions. And I don't think I did a good job of acknowledging their trauma, which I think now that I've grown as an interviewer, I would talk to them more about it and I would engage during those emotional moments. But when I was first starting out, I had a tendency to shy away from it, which I don't think was good.
Can I just ask a follow-up? How would you engage now?
I would ask them questions about, why they're feeling what they're feeling, what triggered their emotion at that time in the interview. It was always, nice to put your hand on them or just to acknowledge that they're going through something difficult. But early on, I didn't really ask about the trauma, which, if they're willing to talk about it, I think it might be useful for them to do so.
Susan here and then a couple over there.
Susan Hartley, you obviously in your memorialisation you had a significantly different narrative than the official one that was going on. How did you deal with that, and was with the pushback from those other agencies that wanted a romanticised story, and has it had an ongoing effect on the way you manage your research?
I was shocked, particularly with Katrina, like how these explanations, even in newspapers that I trusted and news sources that I trusted, were so far away from the stories that I was hearing from first responders. And, they were angry about it. They said this happened there, that it was far worse than what they had initially reported. And so I was taken aback initially, but we just kept doing the interviews and putting it out there to the extent that we can. For Katrina, we did exhibitions for the 1 year and the 5 year anniversary. For the 10th year anniversary, we had that relationship with New Orleans Public Radio, where I think we had a bigger reach. And we've kept that relationship through the oil spill crisis and the COVID crisis, where we've kept our relationship with public radio. And we've also grown in our social media presence. For our COVID interviews, we did a series of separate videos. For some of the more powerful narratives, we hired a videographer to come and do these little 3 or 4 minute produced videos that we could shoot out on social media. So we've grown in our reach, but we are a historical society and we don't have the reach that the media outlets would. But I like to think that we contributed to maybe a more nuanced understanding of what happened.
There's a couple over here, maybe at the back first. Yes.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Catherine Clava. Thank you for acknowledging the trauma experience with the interviews that you did during the interview process. I wanted to ask you if you had discussed how the interviews would be made accessible before you did the interviews. Because of that probably emotional experience for so many people, were you able to outline what you would do with the interviews before they started?
Yeah, we would always do that and just make sure that they wanted to be interviewed. Then we'd offer a restriction on access if they wanted. We were mostly worried about them losing their jobs for criticizing their administrations. And so we always left that open, and a number of our interviews are restricted until 2030. And so that's something. And then we talked about how we might use them. And they really wanted their stories heard, and they all came to the exhibitions that we did, and we're glad that we included their stories.
So, one over here, and then we'll come back over here. Scott.
Thanks, Mark, for a great presentation. My name's Scott McKinnon. I'm just wondering, within the active memory making that you're talking about, whether there's a role for oral history in encouraging people to prepare for the next hurricane, seeing the hurricane as part of environmental cycles, not a kind of neatly wrapped up event in the past, about how people might prepare for the next one.
I think that's a great idea, and I think it would be, particularly with people like first responders, I think that would be a great approach in the interview, because they want to make things better for the next time, and it would give them a purpose in doing the interview. So I think that's a great idea.
Kayleen there, yeah.
Hi, I'm Kayleen, I'm a journalist. How are you? Great talk, thank you. I was wondering, when you go into those locations where there's crisis and trauma, are you going like in the few days after the event, and are you setting up in a central location and people are coming to you, or are you just wandering around and finding the people to interview?
So a little,
how do you select?
Yeah, it was with the Katrina project. It was probably about a month after the storm, and so we went out to the agencies who were actively working and talked to their people. Those interviews we usually conducted at their places of work. There was one, the prison evacuation crisis was a huge story that was part of our Katrina project, where the prisoners were left behind in the prisons in New Orleans, and there was rioting within the prisons and other things. But the State Department of Corrections came down to New Orleans to pick up the prisoners, put down the riots, and do things like that. And so for that, we traveled to each of the state prisons throughout the state and conducted interviews there with their people and a few of the inmates as well.
Thanks. Let's do Elaine over here.
I'm Elaine Rabbit, and thanks very much, Mark, for your very informative talk. I was just wondering, so we've heard that you came in and did these interviews, but when I think of oral history, I'm also wondering not just about that event of Katrina, like what about the background of the people, and like what was the length of the interviews?
That's a good question. They're shorter than I would have liked. With the oil spill project and COVID, they're longer. When we were in the situations with the agencies, we were there for a few days, and so the interviews tended to be shorter. I tried to get as much life story as they would give me and keep them as long as they were willing to stay, but a lot of those interviews were 45 minutes, an hour. Our COVID interviews and the oil spill are longer. With the oil spill project, focused on those involved in the bird rescue effort, so I wanted to explore their biography, to find hints of why they volunteered, how they developed the love of animals and empathy for other creatures. And so those took a more traditional life story approach. Katrina in interviews were more about the event, although I did try to get some life story.
Or Carla at the back.
Thank you. My name is Carla Pascoe-Lang. Thank you so much, Mark. That was a really inspiring presentation. You actually helped me to think through. I've been doing some interviews about climate change and families, and I'm often worried, is it still historical enough, when it's very, very contemporary? I think you've provided some really powerful justifications for why this is still historical work. But I'm also thinking about climate change as we sit here today in the conference, many of us probably nervously watching the emergency apps and whether the rivers are going to flood, break their banks. I'm wondering about these really compelling arguments that you've posed in the context of climate change when crises are increasing in frequency and intensity. Do you have any thoughts about the arguments you've outlined here and how they relate to the work of an oral historian in a time of climate crisis?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Of course, climate change is a slower moving crisis. I imagine there's influences on the media and how they present the issue of climate change. There's probably a lot of people, even in the most impacted areas. We went down to Lafitte, Louisiana, which is a small town which was wiped out by Hurricane Ida, and people were rebuilding, but it's unlikely that that community will survive long. But still there were people that didn't really buy the issue of climate change, even though the evidence all around them was so clear. I don't know, that's a good question.
Thank you. Just those of you who stand, I know some of us are standing up because we've got sore backs, but there are some seats at the front if you want to sit down. Other questions? Yes, Cindy here. Microphone's just coming. If our microphones get close to the chandeliers, I've been warned to be careful, so let me know.
Thank you. My name is Cindy. I'm curious about your use of the phrase "our collective memory," which you used at the beginning, and whose collective memory is our collective memory. And I also have a question, and it's burning, and it's you discussed a bit about the media response, and I'm also thinking about the serial trimming, which I think had a huge impact in how people understood Katrina outside of reunions.
Well, I think collective memory is just probably the dominant narrative and how that's being formed and what is influencing that. Like in New Orleans post-Katrina, it would be this need for optimism. People didn't want to dwell on the bad things that happened, and so there was a tendency to believe it didn't happen and to nurture this love of their community. And in some ways, Treme was part of that. It was an homage to New Orleans, but I think it presented a very realistic portrait. I knew some of the people who the characters were based on, and I think they did a very good job of doing it. They promoted some of the myths. There's the one scene where, I forgot the name of the woman that was looking for her child that had been in prison, and they went to, I think it was St. Gabriel, Louisiana, and there were these freezer trucks of bodies, and she discovers her loved one there. So it's a lot of poignant moments in those, and I really liked Treme.
I've got a question at the back here.
Thank you. My name's Charlie Ward. Mark, I was really struck by something you said about, when you get to a disaster, you've obviously got all the clean-up stuff happening in the immediate response, but I think you also alluded to the merit of engaging people in interview around the causes of disaster and also the short and long-term impacts. So I just wondered if you could say something about how or whether you guys include that sort of longer term perspective in your planning of oral history interviewing?
We haven't done any, I couldn't say that. With the mayor, we've done follow-up interviews related to COVID and with the public health officials, and that's always something that I want to do, to do these longitudinal projects. But there's always a new disaster that happens and other things to do. So I would love to do that. I think it's a great idea to check in. I know that Columbia did a great project, their 9/11 project, where they did this longitudinal interview structure where they interviewed people 5 years after the event and a number of events. So, but they built a very developed sociological framework on who they selected for interviewees, and we didn't do that. So.
Got a question here. Might stand up.
Thank you. I'm Sue Roth, and I'm back in Australia from Scotland for this conference, and restoring memories from my early days in Australia. But recently I saw a film that alludes to this question of collective memory and the passage of time and the construction of memory. There's a film called My Old School, which is about a man in his early 30s who presented himself as a teenager again and went back to school, high school, because he dropped out of medical school and he wanted to re-qualify and get into medical school again. So he spent a lot of time with a lot of teenagers, and he passed, as you might say, and he was revealed on entry to medical school. Embarrassingly, he's one that I work for, but he got into medical school as a teenager, having spent years as a teenager with teenage girls and teenage boys. And the subtext of this was sexual improprieties, or how did a 32-year-old man relate to 16-year-old girls. And he had been a star with a girl, a very attractive girl, in the school play called South Pacific, which involved an on-stage kiss. And my point from a methodological point of view is that this film, you sit there in the cinema and you see this film interviewing the teenagers 20 years later, and they all, 6, 8, 10 of them say that he wasn't sexually active, he wasn't very forthcoming in any way, and there was a kiss on stage, but it was a peck on the cheek. The trouble was, there was a video of the play performance, and the producers produced this, and it was no peck on the cheek. It was a very deep kiss. Sorry. I'm just saying that, and the look on the girl's face was photographed by the videographer, and she was utterly shocked. She had too remembered it as a peck on a cheek, when it was something far more substantial than that. So I'm just saying, memories change over time, memories become collective and become reinforced, and we have to allow for that if you're going to do down the road interviews of how people actually do remember Katrina or all these other incidents without at all detracting from the fact that something very bad happened to those people. And it is part of memory construction can work both ways.
It's a good argument for doing interviews early or soon after a crisis, as I do think we are impacted by these collective narratives over time, and our view of our own memory changes. Our circumstances in life change, which I think alters our memory of past events as well. So I think that's a good argument for crisis oral history.
We've got about just under 10 minutes left. I'm just getting a sense of where the hands are. One there, one there. Here. Yeah.
Thank you. Jill Caution. We're actually sort of located on subtidal area here. We sit below high tide. In 2005-06, the city engineer from Launceston, city engineer Jeff Brayford, actually visited New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and to look at how things were being done levee-wise and so on, because there was a project to renew the levees here. And he came back with a really sort of sensible, well-informed engineering sort of solutions and ideas and what to do. And And one of those main things included in that was there was a flood code was put together, which was all signed by state government, etc., etc. And part of that was not to include residential or educational in this area. And if you walk around now, you'll see student accommodation right next to the levee. Vulnerable population, according to the head of the SES at the time. And new university building being built right over here, right at one of the weakest parts of the levee where there were changes of material. I'm a bit of an expert now because of Jeff Brayford, you see. So where there are changes of material in the levees, they're weaker. And there's a levee gate there, so that's another weakness. What is it about authorities? Is this, and like the City Council has allowed this, they actually dismantled the flood and inundation code, which restricted all this sort of development on a subtidal zone. And is there a sense of denial in amongst authorities of sort of, I'm sort of like thinking, is there a sort of a Titanic effect? That's my new phrase.
Well, I think if they could deny things and get away with it, they would. I think the good thing in Katrina, post-Katrina New Orleans, was how actively political people became, and I think New Orleans was always a city that embraced fun, Mardi Gras, and just having a good time, and they weren't that engaged politically. But that certainly changed after Katrina, and I think that they were, focused on how the city was being protected in the future, and I think that's been a good outcome of Katrina.
Nicolette. I think I know how to stop a microphone wobbling after all these years. There we go.
I'm Nicolette. Following up from Carla and Scott's question, if climate change events are going to become more common and more intense, can we shift the conversation to talk about the ethical and methodological impacts on interviewers? If we are going to be interviewing people in these crisis situations over and over and over again, how do we protect and support ourselves and others from being perhaps traumatised during those interviews?
I think vicarious trauma is a concern. I think particularly if we do a large number of interviews, and people that have been similarly traumatized in the past may be more susceptible to that, but it has all the same symptoms of regular trauma. So I think we should be careful on who we select as interviewers, and if they have a trauma that might come to the surface as a result of interviewing, then we should maybe not include them in the project.
I think, was there someone else? No, okay.
Hi, my name's Louise. Thank you for a very inspiring interview. Just to carry on from that question, maybe throw out the idea, we think of first responders as kind of, sirens or, SES or whatever, but in my experience of documenting the recent drought, we are as first responders, often as the oral historian. So I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think that relationship between journalists and oral historians is something to really think about. We can be a type of journalist, I think, and in some ways I think journalists have turned to oral history in the way they present news, and I think that's a good thing as well. But yeah, I think we need to start thinking of ourselves like a journalist.
One last question over here. Sorry, Linda.
Hi. Just in relation to that.
Very quickly.
Very, very quickly. Just in terms of trauma and journalists as being first responders, that has only really in recent years been acknowledged. And news organisations are much better now at understanding the PTSD that journalists do get, even just covering courts. So I think that's something that oral history has to learn from journalism and address that.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
last one. Hi, I'm Jen. Thank you, Mark, for your really fascinating presentation. My question was just in relation to any hopes that you perhaps have, given that you are undertaking this active role in collection of testimony, in the moment rather than just reflectively. Do you have particular hopes for how that will change the historical record into the future for researchers and what they will have access to?
Yeah, I think, since Katrina, the collecting at my museum has changed significantly. And oral history has become a really big part of that. I think we were initially worried, beyond documenting the crisis, that so much of the stuff that would normally find its way into our museum was lost in the flooding. And so we turned to life story as a way to compensate for that. And so we've built up a very active life story program and have targeted individuals in the community whose lives we want to document. So the nature of our collecting has really changed over the past 2 decades, really as a result of the crisis.
Look, it's been lovely that we've had so much time for discussion, and we'll be able to continue that over the next few days. I've got lots more questions to ask Mark, and I'm sure you have as well. These are themes that have been set up for the next few days, so thank you so much for that, Mark. I'm reminded, as Carla said, that climate change is a slow process, but actually on days like today, and you look at the weather map and look outside and cross the River Esk and think that's pretty close to the edge, and it's about a foot higher than it was last night when I walked across it. These are really significant issues. Your issues and your stories are also ours, although in different sorts of ways. So I'd just like to thank you, Mark. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks for sharing this extraordinary experience and for talking with us about it and setting up so many of the issues that we're going to be discussing over the next few days. Thank you.